Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So thank you for joining our Future-Proofing Your Global Workforce ATMA webinar. Okay, so I think we'll get our ATMA immigration webinar, part of our immigration series that has been kindly brought to us by Debbie Bainon, who joins us again today and will be taking us through today's webinar. Just a little bit about ATMA. I think you all probably by now know all about us. Our vision is to enhance the innovation and development of talent mobility in Asia. If we could go to the next slide. These are some of my colleagues that are on the ATMA board. So we are doing the best we can to bring good content and events to the community here. If we can go to the next slide, that just kind of gives you an idea of the four main pillars that ATMA has. Today, we're working under the education and development, I guess, and events and networking pillars in terms of bringing this webinar to you today. For all of you out there who are interested in our ATMA annual conference, that will be taking place in Singapore on November the 24th. Our early bird or first early bird pricing for the conference actually finishes at the end of this month. So you have about 2 days in order to sign up for the early bird rates for our conference on November the 24th. So please do that if you can. And without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Debbie to take us through our presentation today. So thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, Steve. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining the session today. Essentially future-proofing your global workforce. Today's discussion is focused on a topic that's becoming increasingly important for HR, for mobility, for immigration, and for business leaders. How organizations can plan ahead for the workforce realities going essentially from 2027 maybe through to 2030. We'll be looking at immigration not simply just as a compliance process, but more to complement strategic workforce planning. Organization that can anticipate skills shortages, understand immigration policy changes, and build flexible talent mobility strategies will be much better placed going forward. My name's Debbie Bainon, and I am the Director of Immigration Services for the Asia Pacific region for Crowd Worldwide. Obviously, I'm on the ATMA board, as you've seen, and I'm going to taking you through the key global talent trends, immigration changes, and practical case examples of recommended actions for yourselves, perhaps as either vendors or corporates working within this sphere. The starting point for the session today is relatively straightforward. The rules of global talent are fundamentally changing, and the organizations that are able to plan ahead will be the ones that win. In our previous compliance-focused discussions, we've looked at the immigration rules. We've looked at requirements, sponsor obligations, documentation, eligibility, risk management. Those areas are very, very essential. But today we're moving more towards strategy. So as you can see, perhaps from this slide, there are forces colliding with each other at the same time. You have labor shortages, which are becoming persistent in a lot of markets. Secondly, there's skills gaps widening as technology, digital transformation, AI are changing the capabilities of the way we're working. And thirdly, global competition for talent continues to intensify. So companies and governments all competing for the same levels of talent. So by 2030, talent deficits are expected to be a structural feature around the global economy. This is going to influence how organizations can grow, how they can innovate, how they can scale, and which organizations may stall and which organizations effectively will gain and win. So there is a projection, a quite scary projection, that 85 million jobs projected to go unfilled globally by 2030. That's a lot of jobs. So what is going to happen? And to understand why this is happening, let's look at the actual global talent landscape in a bit more detail. So essentially, you have demographic pressure. APAC holds around 60% of the global population, but that doesn't mean that the talent is evenly available. So just because we have 60% of the global population in this part of the world, doesn't mean to say you have 60% of the talent. There's a lot of, or several major economies in this part of the world, looking at China, Japan, Thailand perhaps, that are facing significant working age population decline by 2050 because their populations are aging. The second one is skills specialization. Employers are not looking for more workers. They're looking for very, very specific skills. They're looking for skills in healthcare. They're looking for skills in engineering, technology, data, AI. Advanced manufacturing are all examples of where demand for skill is growing faster than the actual supply. Geopolitical volatility, we're all aware of this at the moment. You know, there's conflicts, there's sanctions, there's nationality-based restrictions, and concerns around security in other areas, which affect visa processing and also employee mobility. So crisis response is essentially no longer exceptional. It's becoming part of a standard process that we need to take into account when planning for our talent mobility strategies. And the final one on here is economic realignment. You have the China Plus One strategy, which essentially is a business strategy where a lot of companies are now maintaining a lot of operations in China, but also looking to source other locations where they may be able to make sure that business continuity can continue. Diversify the risk. If one area has a problem, they can still continue to operate. It's also looking at, this is driving investment as well. But those locations also, if you're looking at Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, some of these other locations that are now becoming manufacturing bases, they have their own skills shortages as well. So the reality for this part of the world particularly is driving growth is facing talent pressure. So the question maybe for an employer is about, where do we want to grow? Where are we going to get the skills from? And can we move those skills legally, compliantly, sustainable from one location to another? So these pressures are also changing about how governments are looking at immigration as well. So if you look towards the trends shaping the future workforce, essentially you've got skills-based immigration. So we'll come to this in a second, but you have systems now that are moving away from very rigid occupation lists and moving more towards a framework that assesses skills, salaries, qualifications, composition of workforce, diversity, and the economic contribution perhaps that the company is making to that specific location. The second, you have greater workforce flexibility. And this means that essentially employees are having a little bit more portability in relation to their visas that allows them to move around and cannot guarantee that the employer has a retention of that employee just because they have a visa. And again, I'll come to that in a little bit later on. The third trend is the digital immigration systems, which we are now all seeing, especially across this part of the world. In Europe, it's also becoming quite obvious that digital entries are becoming much more apparent. Governments are investing in online platforms. They're using automated verification, real-time tracking, AI-assisted processing. It's increasing the speed, perhaps, of some of the work that's being done, but there is a lot more visibility and a lot more scrutiny. And as I'm about to say, the scrutiny and compliance is now critical. It is intensifying. Technically, because now you're going through a digital arrival process, maybe not even using a passport, you're not seeing an immigration officer. But that does not mean that immigration officer is not doing work behind the scenes. And this is where the increased compliance is now very much coming in. And so the implications of these changes and these trends for businesses and for employers and for immigration processes is quite significant. Access to talent is becoming conditional. And those employers that can demonstrate stronger workforce planning, fair hiring, make sure that they're mature in their compliance with the regulations, basically will be better placed and not just react when they have a vacancy and come up. They will have planning in place in order to do that. And to give a little bit of
Debbie, what's the first sort of practical step an organization can take to get more, to start planning more strategically rather than just perhaps, doing things at the offer stage of when they're offering a contract to somebody or whatever, then trying to figure out what to do for immigration?
I think the most important thing is that they need to start to think a lot more closely for the future. Start by mapping their critical roles. What are the critical roles going to be for them in the future, maybe in the next 2 years, 2027, 2028? Where are the hiring needs? What are the required skills that are going to be needed? And then looking at that, look then at the available immigration pathways. Right. Importantly, look at lead times. Immigration advisors should always be part of this planning process. Don't essentially bring immigration into the picture after, as you've just suggested, an offer has been made. Make it part of the planning process. And if you do that, you will be far better placed in order to assess what you can do and, more importantly, when it needs to be done.
Right. Okay, good advice. Thank you.
So moving forward, I just want to give a little bit of a demonstration coming back to what I suggested about the governments now moving away from pretty strict occupation lists, which do still exist, but moving more towards a framework that has a wider assessment. So I wanted to highlight the Singapore Compass-based process. This was introduced in September 2023 for new assignments and became apparent for renewals in September 2024. And essentially what this Compass process is doing is asking not just whether a candidate has a job offer, it's looking at the overall quality of the application in total through several different lenses. It's looking at the salary. That's the first element of this process. Is there a salary minimum that is being met? I've highlighted the minimum salaries for the employment pass, both now and again when they change in January 2027. But these are the minimum salaries for essentially new entrants at, say, age 22, 23. What Compass does is actually set a minimum salary for every single age, essentially up until the age of 45 and beyond. So someone may require a salary of 5,600 Singapore dollars if they're entering the labour market and need an employment pass and they're aged 21 or 22. But as an example, if you're aged 40 to 45, that's minimum salary is going to be 10,000 Singapore dollars or more. And there is a specific process that you can download the minimum salaries, and they're very, very transparent. But it is quite important, and that is the first element of the Compass qualification: meet the salary requirements. And once you meet the salary requirements, you then have to essentially make 40 points. So this means then that the lenses are the salary, the qualifications, as I mentioned here, the employer nationalities and diversity. So they're looking at how many locals are being employed, how many Singaporeans, how many PRs, and then looking at the foreigners. There isn't a specific quota, but there is a very, very strong look at the diversity of the workforce. So essentially, what has happened as part of this process, and this is very recent in January 2026, they have created a shortage occupation list. So clearly, even Singapore, with all of the employment pass holders and all of the people that are coming into Singapore, there is a need for specific sectors that have talent requirements. So if you look at the agri-tech, the FinServe, the green economy, healthcare, maritime, semiconductors, all of these new kind of different types of technologies that are coming in, those are now classed as short-term shortage occupations, and that means then that roles in these sectors earn additional points. So the strategic really implication for Compass is that employers shouldn't really be waiting for an offer to be made to somebody that they're trying to identify. You need to look at all of these points ahead of time. You need to do an eligibility assessment. You need to make a decision whether or not this person is going to qualify under the Compass requirements. What actually happened in September 2024 was that a lot of employees that were holding employment passes that had been issued prior to the 1st of September 2024, when they then came to look at the renewals, they did not qualify. They were not eligible. And primarily, they fell at the very first hurdle, which was the salary requirement. Because a lot of those employment passes had been issued on probably very close to minimum salaries, but they were met. But those people that were then looking to renew were a little bit older. And so it meant then that they did not meet the salary requirements. And there was a lot of...
It's not just a little bit older, is it? It's also that they keep changing the minimums as well, right? So the minimums continue to rise as well.
To rise, exactly. And of course, if you're looking to have dependents with you, the requirements are even higher again. So you're absolutely right, Steve. Yes, that is exactly the case. So essentially, added to the actual requirements is the planning for the paperwork that needs to be involved with the actual process itself. Because for Compass, as an example, Singapore now requires qualifications for employment passes and S passes to be independently verified. So this means that there's more time needed before the application can actually be submitted to get those verifications in place. So again, you may need a notarization, you may need a translation if the document is not in English. Those both notarizations, legalizations, and translations themselves don't take too long, but the legalization process can. And also the verification. The verification has to be done ahead of a submission.
Yeah, I've had cases with the verification where it's taken close to 2 months to get something verified. Everybody goes on holiday for 4 weeks or whatever in Europe, so all the universities are on holiday, and there's no one there to do the verifications, and you have to wait until they return. So got to be very careful with that because it can take a long time to get things verified.
That's very true. The recommendation that we would kind of provide is that you should build in a 2 to 3 month buffer just to get that process completed, because it isn't just the fact that somebody may not be available. It may be that they're not responding.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
We have this kind of example whereby, you know, you're trying to contact a university, and you know, you're just not getting a response, and that then of course completely holds the process up. So it is important to, when you're planning, that you meet the criterion and you think about the criterion before you start to make offers, but also that the planning in relation to the trail of documentation that is required is also included in the process that you're going through. But Singapore is not the only market, essentially, where these frameworks are being redesigned. Another country that is basically providing different types of frameworks is Australia. Australia has done a lot of regulatory change in the last probably 18 months to 2 years. And now you have the skills in demand, which is affectionately known as the SID visa. It is still a subclass 482 employment visa, but it's now called the skills in demand visa, which again is indicating that the framework is very much linked to not just somebody wanting to work in Australia. It's about what the Australians need in their workforce. So you have 3 different streams under the skills in demand subclass 482. You have the specialist skills stream, which is primarily designed for high earners, and their salary threshold, and these salary thresholds that are highlighted here, the 146,546, literally was the new salary implemented from the 1st of July 2026. I've highlighted the earlier levels, 135 and in 2024 to 25, and 141 in 25 to 26, just to highlight and demonstrate how quickly this is increasing. But essentially, this stream is particularly relevant for senior specialists, executives, niche and high demand roles, whereby an employer is maybe prepared to pay a little bit more in order to get somebody into the role itself. The primary list is the core skill stream list. Now that does still have a detailed occupation list. So the occupation that is being filled does have to be on that list. And the salary threshold is now essentially 500 Australian dollars below 80,000 Australian dollars. And that is literally just the salary. That's not all the associated costs with superannuation and everything else that come with what you pay in Australia. But I think here the highlight is just quite important to demonstrate that up until the 30th of June 2023, the minimum salary was 53,900 Australian dollars, and that had not changed for probably 10 to 15 years. And then all of a sudden in 2023, it was increased very significantly from 53,900 to 70,000. Then it went up to 73, then it went to 76, and now it's gone up to nearly 8. Next year, it will be over 80,000 Australian dollars. And these roles are designed for mid-skilled occupations on that skilled occupation list. And then finally, you have the labour agreement stream. So there are quite a few countries that have labour agreements with Australia. Singapore is one, the UK is another one. The level of salary requirements are the same, but some of the actual criterion for the visa itself are different. So if you're going in on a subclass 482 under the labour stream agreement, you do not need to do labour market testing. Whereas on the core stream skills, you do need to do labour market testing. So there are some important kind of benefits if you have a country that has a labour agreement stream. But one of the most important changes that has taken place within Australia is what we would call employee portability. That means that essentially someone with a subclass 482 visa If they decide to leave the employer, or if the employer makes them redundant, as an example, if for any reason they leave that role, normally and previously they would have to leave Australia. Now there is a new regulation in place that allows someone to remain in Australia up to 180 days to look for a new job. So providing they held a subclass 482 visa and they are continuing to actively look for a new role, and they can find a new role within 180 days, they can remain in Australia. And the nomination from the earlier visa is then replaced by a nomination from a new employer, and then the visa itself remains valid until such time as it would have expired before. But that is a huge change, and employers benefit from that because it means that they have somebody physically present in Australia already, and it means that they have the ability to actually take that person on much more quickly than if they'd had to leave Australia and come back. So that's quite important in relation to workforce planning. So the idea is that Australia is trying to retain the skills that it's brought in, but not necessarily giving the employer the ability to retain.
So how would you suggest that employers use these types of frameworks, to sort of shape their strategy or whatever it is towards planning, rather than just make visa applications being a sort of reactive thing when you get to that part in the process, right? How can they
Yeah.
use these types of frameworks to be a little bit more strategic or planned and better?
I think they should be used as planning tools. Don't think about them as kind of barriers. Think about it as a planning tool. So if you know that you've got the compass, or you need to understand that the role needs to fit an occupation, or that basically there isn't an occupation list, but you've got a framework that's designed to try and be a lot wider in relation to salaries, and then the actual job itself, and then the diversity. You need to be able to design the roles that you're looking for with appropriate salaries that meet the minimum requirements, but also obviously are going to attract the talent that you're looking for. A lot of employers will potentially verify the qualifications at the recruitment stage, because if you do that, then you don't have to do it a second time for the compass requirements. If it's done once, that's all it needs. So maybe think about that and look at your policies around recruitment, and perhaps look at education verification at the recruitment stage,
Right.
knowing that it might well be needed in the future to help you with your visa process. Then you're going to save yourself perhaps 15 to 20, 25 days in that visa process. The earlier you think about some of these processes, there's going to be more certainty around the visa decision as well. And the other thing to bear very much in mind is that minimum salaries, as we've quite rightly highlighted, both in Singapore and in Australia and in a lot of other locations, do increase. So you're going to have to also think about that when you're recruiting, designing roles, looking to bring people in and making them an offer, because you're not going to probably be able to stick to that salary for more than maybe 12 months. So you've also then got to think about, oh, well, we are going to have to pay this person more in order to keep them. So it's a lot more planning required. And I think the more that can be planned ahead of time with some of these points in mind, you're going to be much further forward in relation to ensuring that you can A, attract the talent that you're looking for, and B, that they will then meet the visa requirement that will follow.
Okay, thank you.
So essentially, the immigration environment is moving in a little bit more of a different direction as well. So if we look at workforce flexibility, digital systems, and scrutiny, we've touched on this a little bit already, but the idea is that essentially, from a flexibility perspective, assignment types are changing as well. The world mobility world is not the same as it was pre-COVID. COVID changed a huge amount, and things are still continuing to change. The traditional expatriate assignment model doesn't necessarily really exist anymore. Employers are using a lot more short-term mobility, maybe regional or intra-regional assignments, project-based movements, especially where IT and other kind of areas like that are involved. Commuter assignments, again, this is looking at the individual themselves and what the individual needs, as well as what the employer needs. And at the same time, skilled workers, as I've just highlighted, are getting a little bit more flexible in relation to what they can do as well. So the flexibility from the workforce perspective comes from both sides. It needs to come from the employer a little bit more, and also the employee has a little bit more flexibility as well. From a digital perspective, AI-powered tools are increasingly being used to reduce or to improve processing efficiency, using AI to track applications, detect inconsistencies, detect documents that are missing. This can be very positive because it creates a little bit more transparency, and it can mean faster decisions. But it also means that at submission point, errors are much more visible, and it can be difficult to perhaps submit something if you don't have absolutely everything that's required right from the outset, which is another really important point about the planning perspective that we've been talking about. From the scrutiny perspective, as I've just highlighted, there is a lot more compliance scrutiny underway at the moment. Sponsor transparency, the regulations around being a sponsor are tightening, and there is a lot more scrutiny on employers to ensure that they are meeting the requirements. The governments have got a lot more tools now in order to do this. They can compare data. They will be sharing data internally from different departments. And they will be able to assess quite rightly whether or not tax, as an example, will be highlighting salaries being paid. So they can check whether or not the minimum salaries are being paid for people that are earning and holding visas. So speed and scrutiny rising together, but faster systems don't mean necessarily a lower risk. I think the critical point here is it actually means less tolerance for poor documentation, a weak job design, as an example, or if there's a compliance gap anywhere. So with all of that in mind, I think what we need to ensure now is that things need to move, and everyone needs to move to be much more strategic. The art of being reactive doesn't work anymore. Strategy and being strategic is far more important. And so essentially what we're looking for now is the planning through an immigration lens. So essentially now, where immigration has often been managed after the hiring decision, which is what we've talked about, the business needs to look at a candidate and then change the approach. Immigration needs to be embedded in the recruitment process and in the workforce planning process right from the very beginning. So some of the questions that maybe need to be asked are, Where are the skills? What are we going to need between i.e. in the next 2 to 3 years? What pathways, what immigration pathways will align with with our business and the markets that we want to move to? Is there a pathway available? And if there isn't, what do we do? How do we manage that? Understand what lead times are for those pipelines, because that is critical. As we've discussed, something may take months to resolve. And if you need that person in place in 4 weeks, your business is going to be impacted by the immigration process. But if you're planning ahead and you're thinking about this 12, 18 months, 20 months, and 24 months in advance, then you will be better placed to ensure that your requirements are met at the timing that they need to be met. And then also another real situation, which a lot of employers don't necessarily think about, especially in areas where they aren't necessarily directly affected straight away, is the geopolitical scenarios. You know, a lot of the Iran and the Middle East has always been an area whereby there are geopolitical issues going on. But the reality is they affect everyone. And the implications of what's going on in one part of the world can impact another part of the world as well. So you need to be aware of what is going on the wider scale as well. So, and I think the other side to the planning is, if you think about this, one question, if you think about Australia and New Zealand as an example, perhaps not so much in other locations, but a lot of people that are looking perhaps to relocate or take up assignments in Australia and New Zealand are probably going to be moving from a very long way away. And the question that is always asked is there a pathway to permanent residence? So that's another point for employers and workforce planning to think about in relation to the immigration side of things. You know, is there a pathway to permanent residence? That's the first question. And then secondly, are we as an employer prepared to actually support that individual candidate through the permanent residence process when it becomes available? Australia, again, a very good example of this. Towards the end of 2024, when the SID visa was introduced, essentially the short-term and the medium-term visa was eradicated. Visas can now be issued from 1 year to 4 years. But anyone who was on a short-term visa before November 2024 did not have a pathway to permanent residence. But as soon as those regulations changed and Australia recognized that they needed to try and do something to retain the skills that were coming in, they then opened the permanent residence pathway to any subclass 482 SID visa holder, providing they had been working with an employer for up to 3 years. So the employer can support the permanent residence pathway, or they can choose to say to the candidate, yes, we'll support it, we'll pay part of the fees, but you're going to have to pay the remainder. And again, that's part of a retention policy, perhaps. But one thing to also remember from that perspective is that if someone has permanent residence, they can move and change jobs at any time because they won't need then a visa to do that. But permanent residence is a very big deal in some parts of the world, and Australia and New Zealand particularly, in relation to the planning, recruitment, and the immigration side of any specific mobility function. So to make this a little bit more practical, what I wanted to try and do was highlight a case scenario. So we have a technology company expanding in Southeast Asia. The business needed engineering and data analytics talent, but the immigration strategy was thought about as an afterthought, i.e. they weren't considering it. So looking at this under the old approach, applications were taking 3 to 5 months. There were processing delays that meant project timelines were slipping. Key hires were potentially lost to competitors. But if the planning had taken place 12 to 18 months ahead of time, the roles would have been mapped out. This was a Singaporean example. The compass requirements would have been taken into account. Everyone that was recruited would have been eligible. The documentation would have been prepared in advance. Applications submitted 10 to 14 days after submission, you have the in principle approval and the person can arrive. So it does highlight how important it is in order to plan ahead. From the design approach, essentially this is related to the jobs themselves. You know, essentially the role wasn't paying the right salaries. There was no strategy involved. So again, the company had to look at the roles, look at their salary thresholds, introduce a graduate pathway, because you can get a training visa in Singapore, but introduce graduate pathways in order to allow people to develop through, to allow those salary requirements to be met. And again, the more you plan, the more you think ahead, the likelihood is then that you will get the talent that you need and you will be able to get the visa for them and you will be able to retain it. And then coming back to the deployment perspective, you know, the company had a hiring campaign. It did it without even thinking about what they wanted, how they were going to get these people into the location that they wanted them to be in. And then obviously that meant then that there were rejections and delays. So looking at something pre-approved, looking at the requirements, making sure that the campaigns highlighted what was going to be required in order for the person to be able to move, would have allowed them to make that much more strategic and much more successful. So the lesson from this case study essentially is that the conversation around immigration really must start at the workforce planning stage, not when you're starting to make offers.
Okay.
So looking at the planning, just adding to this through the immigration lens. So map the talent geography, identify where you need critical skills, not just where maybe the office has offices. Look at the skills by market, look at an intelligence map from a global perspective or a regional perspective, depending on the company itself. Build immigration lead times into your planning. I think, you know, we've highlighted this. It's absolutely critical. You know, you need to factor anything between probably 9 to 12 months in advance into visa times. Coming back to Australia, one thing that has happened with the Australian regulatory change is that it is now taking anything between 6, 7, 8 months for a skills in demand visa to be approved. You need to think about that. You know, you may well qualify, you may well have something on the occupation list, you may well be meeting the minimum requirement for salaries, but if it's going to take 7 or 8 months for the Department of Home Affairs to make the decision, nobody has any control over that. But you need to plan for that before you start this process. Even accredited sponsors who generally were getting visa decisions in anything between 10 to 14 days are now waiting up to 3 months. And that needs to be built in to ensure that the operational side of the business is not affected by the immigration processes. We've highlighted this, but scenario plan for geopolitical disruption. I was at a conference not so long ago whereby a company or an employer had people in the air, in transit, on the way to Dubai, just as the Iran war was kicking off. And of course, the question then is, what do we do? I've got people in 2 or 3 different locations. They can't now go to Dubai because Dubai is obviously being affected by what is going on there. But they don't have a visa to stay in this location, and they don't really want to go home because they now don't have anywhere they can live. So you need to plan ahead for some of these scenarios. Identify maybe where you could get a varying talent from, or look at visa pathways for transits or other locations to ensure that the person has an alternative if they can't get to where they need to go, especially if the role is a high risk role. Engage immigration advisors. A lot of companies will maybe have in-house HR managers who do have some immigration experience. But if you have an immigration vendor, the sensible way to do this is engage them at the outset. Immigration vendors are strategic partners. They will advise you on what you need to know to help you plan for your workforce. You are going to be giving that vendor the immigration visa application when you're moving forward. So engage them right at the very beginning. It's really important to have a seat at the table. It's really important that immigration has a seat at the table from the planning stage onwards.
Just on that topic of the immigration advice, your immigration advisor being important, as sort of AI becomes more prominent in sort of processing applications, where is it going to be important that there is human judgment and sort of specialists involved in the process? What parts can AI do versus what parts should the humans be doing in this process?
AI can improve the document verification, obviously. It can involve tracking, it can involve processing, but it cannot replace strategic judgment. The human expertise remains absolutely critical for complex cases. At the end of the day, there are nuances within the regulations that really human experience will be able to help with. AI won't have that background. So that is really the critical point. It's about judgment. It's about advice. It's about talking through things, using experience as well. It's more about really just making sure that you complement the technology with the human expertise. That's the critical point.
Okay. Understood.
And obviously, just added to that, the immigration reform, the regulatory updates are really, really important. But the critical point is, and as immigration vendors, we need to ensure that when we give the regulatory advice to our clients, that you give them the strategic side to it. You give them the idea of how that is going to impact their population, how it is going to potentially impact their workforce planning. So it's not about just giving them information. It's about being that strategic partner that we've just discussed.
Okay.
And coming back to AI, AI is shaping what's happening. It's changing services, but changing. It's helping with detection of fraud. It's essentially helping compliance. But essentially, yes, the technology will help with verification and fraud detection. It will help automate processing. It says it reduces backlogs, but backlogs can still build up depending on what location it is and how many cases are actually being managed. you know, chatbots can help, but a lot of people don't like speaking to chatbots. They prefer the human element, as we've just discussed. And, you know, the AI will help with real-time case tracking. But at the end of the day, the strategic advice, the scenario planning really needs to be done from a human perspective. The relationship management that we provide with the clients, with stakeholders, with government officials as necessary, that's human. You know, complex case adjudication, AI isn't always accurate. AI can't always do everything at the moment. It can only do what it's been trained to do. So where something is very, very complex, you need that experience, you need that human touch. And obviously the human touch really is there to support employees through something that's pretty stressful for them, guide them through the visa process, because they won't have that experience. Allow them to ask you questions. You know, a lot of the case managers have actually got their own personal experiences of the visa process in that specific location, so they can answer questions. AI can't do that.
Right.
So I think that's really important. And so just moving on, you know, what really should we be doing? So look at sponsorship, look at your audit, or you know, or effectively audit your, you know, which roles are business critical, which roles potentially are at risk. Look at the headcount. What are you looking to do in the future? Can you identify an immigration pathway in a specific location that will meet your requirements? Look at those immigration timelines. Look at those locations where there are long lead roles. You need to pre-plan ahead. Even for the likes of Australia, you need to be planning 12 months ahead to ensure you can get the visa in place ahead of when you're starting. Look at a geopolitical risk register. It's relatively straightforward, but you can do that. And again, AI can help you with that, probably. Look at nationalities which actually create risks. Just as an example, I have a client at the moment who has a very critical project in the US. And this is a very good example of poor business planning. They need 30 people in the US, and they need those people in the US in the middle of August. But they have only approached us in the last 3 weeks, given us an idea of this project and said, this is what we need. We need 30 people in the US with L1 employment visas by the middle of August. Now, the reality of that is not going to happen anyway, because the L1 employment visa is going to take a lot longer than 3 to 4 weeks to obtain. The second problem, coming back to the nationality side of this, is that a lot of these assignees are going to be moving from India. And so the other poor planning side to this is that the US embassy in India, or the US consulates in India, have wait lists of anything between 6 to 9 months just for a visa interview. So the reality is, this is a very good example of why workforce planning and immigration need to be very, very closely brought together, because this scenario is not going to work. And now then the client is thinking, well, can we send these people as business visitors? And the answer to that question is very highly likely to be no, because the criteria is that you need them there to work, and you cannot work as a business visitor. And even as a business visitor, you need, as an Indian national, you need a visa, and you then need to wait for that interview. So so what they're now looking at is, can we put people from other locations? So they're starting to think about the planning now. Can we potentially send these people from Singapore because they can get an H-1B visa because there's a labor agreement? Can we potentially send people from Mexico because there is a labor agreement in place with the US? They can potentially get people a little bit more quickly, but it's still going to take a longer period of time than they need. It is a very, very good example of why workforce planning and immigration need to be together right from the very, very beginning, and with a long timeline in place. So obviously review your sponsorship compliance and make sure that that's important. Engage the partner early, as we've said. Business leaders and planners need to be involved in this process right from the very beginning. You know, HR, World Mobility need to ensure that the high level strategic partners need to be advised as well. And then obviously use the immigration tools as well. And so really just kind of highlighting three key takeaways. Immigration is a strategic workforce lever. It's not an operational task anymore. It's really important, as we've highlighted over the last 45 minutes or so, that it's embedded in the workforce planning right from the very beginning. Skills-based systems do reward proactive employers, as is highlighted by the Compass and SID examples. Look at what the requirements are, use those in order to plan, and you will then be rewarded by getting a visa. The talent war is going to be won by organizations that do plan anything between 12 and 24 months ahead. It's really, really important that that is done. And just to finish, what I really wanted to highlight also is points that are important where you can have an application fail. The credibility of the role itself. Is it a genuine role? Is it obviously something that's being created just to get a visa? Or is it vague? Is the title actually tied in with the structure of the company itself? More importantly, does it fit the person and the person's CV as well? Is the person credible for that actual role itself?
Coming back saying to the scrutiny of this is becoming.
It is right. Very much so. And of course, the other side to that scrutiny is also about, can it be done locally? There are some countries whereby, India is a very good example of this, whereby a company is looking to bring in an overseas national to do a role. And the question is, well, why can't this be done locally? Why can a local not do this? Because in India, as an example, all employment visas are processed through the Indian embassies. And that is another example of a problem in itself, because obviously each Indian embassy, much as there is a strategic framework, work on their own individual requirements. So what an Indian embassy in the UK maybe asks for is not going to be the same as an Indian embassy in Singapore, as an example.
Right.
But yes, so it's about the credibility of the role, and also on top of everything else, can it be done by a local? And do the qualifications truly match the role itself? Weak, irrelevant, or unverifiable credentials will weaken the case for an approval. So somebody may have a degree, but is that degree actually relevant to the role that they're coming to do? Is it relevant to the job that they're going to do? Maybe not, which means you can't necessarily use it. So that's really important. Market rate salaries. Does the minimum threshold meet the market rate? And as we mentioned for Compass, yes, there are minimum salaries, but if the role itself is a very highly qualified role, it's not going to be set at a minimum salary rate. You have to look at a benchmark for the role itself, for the skills that are required. Is it a market rate? And those salary appropriatenesses are being looked at quite closely. And if they don't meet them, there will be a rejection. Employer compliance, this is really important. And where employers have been found to be non-compliant, the authorities will then turn around and say, no, we're not going to be giving you more visas. Do you have a good standing on quotas? Do you have workforce ratios that you're meeting? Are you meeting fair hiring rules, fair consideration framework in Singapore, as an example? So it is important that compliance is understood. And if you're not compliant, there is a risk that visas will not be approved. And the documentation quality, this is a critical one. And it's becoming more and more important because more governments and authorities are asking for more documents up front. The most recent example of this is New Zealand, when New Zealand is now insisting that a police clearance certificate, where it is required, is actually in place before submission of the application. Whereas before, you could put the application in and wait for the police clearance certificate to show up maybe a couple of months later. Now that can't happen. The documentation has to be in place before the application is submitted. And if you don't have that documentation, the application will be rejected, and they won't keep it and wait for you to submit it. They will reject it and then say, submit when you're ready with everything. So it's really, really important that the documentation is in place. And that essentially completes the presentation, and I hope that's been really, really helpful. I haven't left a huge amount of time for questions, but
you've used up 59 of the 60 minutes, so congratulations.
Does anybody have any questions? I really do hope that this has been insightful and it's been helpful.
Yeah, I did send out a message to everybody if they did have any questions. I don't have any at this stage, so if there's anybody out there that does want to ask one last question, is probably all we've got time for. I can take that question now. I don't see anything coming in at the moment, though.
Okay. Well, I think
we're pretty good.
And we will be sharing the presentation, and we will be sharing the link to the recording. So if anyone has any questions after the session, by all means, you're very, very welcome to contact myself through ATMA, and I'm very, very happy to answer any questions going forward.
Thank you, Debbie. That's been excellent. And if you could just flick to the last slide, I believe we have a QR code to register or sponsor for our conference. So please, everybody, November the 24th in Singapore is our conference. If you're not in Singapore, we also have a virtual component to the conference again this year. So there will be probably about half of the content of the conference will be virtually streamed. So you can even join if you're in another location in Asia. So please do join us on the 24th of September in person in Singapore or virtually from anywhere in Asia. Thank you very much. So thank you again, Debbie. It's been a wonderful session, and to everybody out there, thank you for joining, and please do join our future webinars as well on lots of different topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you.